The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Clarence House as Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell walked through the grand entrance hall. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, each sound seeming to bounce off the oil paintings of long-dead royals that lined the walls. She had been called to investigate what palace officials were calling a routine security audit. But Sarah's 20 years of experience told her that nothing involving the royal family was ever routine. Queen Camilla had been away on a state visit to Australia for the past 2 weeks, and protocol demanded that certain security measures be implemented during extended absences. What should have been a standard procedure had taken an unexpected turn when palace guards discovered discrepancies in the inventory of royal treasures stored in the Queen's private quarters. Sarah's partner, Detective Sergeant James Hartwell, caught up with her as she paused before an ornate door marked with the royal coat of arms. "The head of palace security is waiting inside," he said, checking his notes. "Commander Thompson. He seems quite agitated about something." Commander Richard Thompson was indeed agitated. The 60-year-old veteran of royal protection had served the monarchy for over 3 decades, and Sarah had never seen him look so troubled. His usually immaculate uniform showed signs of stress, and his hands trembled slightly as he gestured toward a mahogany desk covered with official documents and photographs. "Detective Inspector, thank you for coming so quickly," Thompson began, his voice tight with concern. "We have a situation that requires the utmost discretion. During our routine security sweep of Her Majesty's private chambers, we discovered that several items listed in the royal inventory are missing." Sarah pulled out her notebook, her training taking over despite the unusual circumstances. "What kind of items are we talking about, Commander?" Thompson handed her a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed with age. "These are heirlooms that have been in the royal collection for generations. Some date back to Queen Victoria's reign. We're talking about jewelry, ceremonial pieces, and documents of significant historical value." As Sarah flipped through the pages, she noticed that many entries had been marked with red ink, indicating items that could not be located during the recent audit. The value of the missing pieces was staggering, but she knew that their historical significance made them truly irreplaceable. "When was the last time these items were accounted for?" she asked. "That's part of the problem," Thompson admitted. "Some of these pieces haven't been formally catalogued in over 5 years. The Queen has access to her private collection at any time, of course, but we maintain records for insurance and security purposes." Detective Sergeant Hartwell had been quietly examining the photographs that accompanied each inventory entry. "These are beautiful pieces," he remarked, holding up a photo of an ornate tiara studded with diamonds and sapphires. "This particular piece is listed as the Cambridge Lover's Knot Tiara. According to this, it was a favorite of Princess Diana." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The missing items weren't just valuable, they were pieces of living history, each one carrying the weight of royal tradition and public memory. The investigation was becoming more complex by the minute. "Commander, I need to understand the security protocols," Sarah said. "Who has access to the Queen's private quarters?" Thompson consulted another set of documents. "Access is extremely limited. Her Majesty, of course, her personal staff, and a select group of trusted palace employees who have been thoroughly vetted. We're talking about perhaps a dozen people total. And during the Queen's absence? Even more restricted. Only essential personnel for maintenance and security checks. Every entry is logged and monitored." Sarah made a note to review all access logs for the past month. She was beginning to form a picture of what might have happened, but she needed more information before drawing any conclusions. The investigation took on a new dimension when Thompson led them to the Queen's private sitting room. The space was elegant but surprisingly cozy, filled with personal photographs and mementos that showed a more human side of the monarchy. Sarah noticed that several display cases that should have contained jewelry and small artifacts were notably empty. "The Queen keeps her most treasured pieces here," Thompson explained. "Items that have personal significance beyond their monetary value. Some belong to the late Queen Elizabeth, others to the Queen Mother." As Sarah examined the empty cases, she noticed something odd. The security locks on several of them appeared to have been opened properly, not forced. Whoever had taken the items had either possessed the correct keys or had intimate knowledge of the security systems. "Commander, I need a complete list of everyone who has accessed these rooms in the past month," Sarah said. "I also need to know about any recent changes in staff, any new personnel, or anyone who might have had reason to be in these areas." Thompson nodded grimly. I've already begun compiling that information. However, I must stress the sensitive nature of this investigation. If word of this gets out to the press before we recover the missing items, it could cause significant embarrassment to the royal family. Sarah understood the implications. The royal family had worked hard to maintain their reputation and public trust. A theft of this magnitude, especially involving pieces with such historical significance, could damage that carefully cultivated image. As they continued their examination of the Queen's quarters, Sarah's mind was already working through the possibilities. The theft appeared to be an inside job, given the sophisticated knowledge required to bypass the security systems. But who would have both the access and the motivation to steal from the Queen herself? The afternoon was wearing on, and Sarah knew that time was working against them. With each passing hour, the stolen items could be moved further away or worse, sold to private collectors who might never return them. The thought of these priceless pieces of British heritage disappearing forever into the black market was almost unbearable. We need to move quickly but carefully, Sarah told her partner as they prepared to begin interviewing the palace staff. This isn't just about solving a theft. These items represent centuries of royal history. We're not just looking for stolen property. We're trying to recover pieces of the nation's heritage. The investigation was just beginning, but Sarah already sensed that this case would test every skill she had developed during her career. The stakes were higher than any case she had worked before, and the pressure to solve it quickly and discreetly was immense. The investigation began in earnest the following morning, when Sarah and James arrived at Clarence House to conduct their first round of interviews. The palace staff had been informed that a routine security audit was taking place, but Sarah could sense the underlying tension in the air. Word had somehow spread that something significant was happening. Even though Commander Thompson had tried to maintain strict confidentiality, their first interview was with Margaret Whitfield, the Queen's personal dresser and closest confidant among the staff. Margaret had worked for the royal family for over 15 years and had an impeccable reputation. She was a slight woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, and her hands shook slightly as she sat across from the detectives in the small interview room that had been set up for their use. Mrs. Whitfield, Sarah began gently, we understand you have regular access to Her Majesty's private quarters. Can you tell us about your duties and when you last saw the items we've discussed? Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper as she replied, I help Her Majesty with her wardrobe each morning when she's in residence. I also maintain her jewelry collection, making sure everything is clean and properly stored. She paused, wringing her hands. I noticed some pieces were missing about a week ago, but I assumed Her Majesty had moved them for some reason. It's not unusual for her to take certain items with her when traveling. Sarah made careful notes. Which pieces did you notice were missing? The sapphire parure that belonged to Queen Mary, and several brooches that Her Majesty wears regularly. Also, there was an emerald bracelet that she's particularly fond of. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I should have reported it immediately, but I didn't want to alarm anyone unnecessarily. James leaned forward. Mrs. Whitfield, in your 15 years here, have you ever noticed anything unusual? Any staff members acting strangely or any security concerns? Margaret hesitated before answering. There has been something, but I'm not sure if it's relevant. She glanced toward the door as if checking that no one was listening. About 6 months ago, we hired a new security guard, David Chen. He seemed very interested in learning about the palace routines, asking lots of questions about schedules and procedures. Sarah's attention sharpened. What kind of questions? He wanted to know about the Queen's travel schedule, when the rooms were cleaned, who had access to different areas. At first I thought he was just being thorough in his new job, but some of his questions seemed unnecessary. After Margaret left, Sarah and James reviewed their notes. The mention of David Chen was the first concrete lead they had, and Sarah made a mental note to prioritize his interview. Their next subject was William Hughes, the senior footman who had been with the royal household for over 20 years. William was a tall, dignified man who carried himself with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in royal service. Unlike Margaret, he seemed completely composed and answered their questions with military precision. Mr. Hughes, Sarah began, your duties bring you into contact with many areas of the palace. Have you noticed anything unusual in recent weeks? William considered the question carefully before responding. Detective Inspector, in 20 years of royal service, I've learned that discretion is paramount. However, I have observed some concerning behavior that I feel duty-bound to report. Please go on. David Chen, one of our newer security staff, has been accessing areas beyond his authorized zones. I've seen him in corridors where he has no business being, particularly near Her Majesty's private quarters. When questioned, he always had a plausible explanation, but the pattern troubled me. James looked up from his notes. Did you report these concerns to Commander Thompson? I mentioned it informally, but I didn't want to get the young man in trouble if there was an innocent explanation. Perhaps that was a mistake on my part. The picture of David Chen was becoming clearer, and Sarah was eager to speak with him. However, when they requested his presence for an interview, they were told that he had called in sick that morning. Commander Thompson immediately dispatched officers to his residence, but they found the apartment empty with signs that Chen had left quickly, taking only essential belongings. It looks like our prime suspect has fled, James observed as they stood in Chen's spartanly furnished apartment. The few personal items left behind revealed little about the man, but Sarah noticed that his computer was missing, along with any documents that might have provided clues about his background or connections. Commander Thompson was visibly shaken when they reported Chen's disappearance. I personally vetted his application, he said, his face pale. His references checked out. His background investigation was clean. How could we have missed this? Sarah sympathized with Thompson's distress, but she needed to focus on the investigation. Commander, we need a complete review of Chen's employment file, his work schedule, and any security footage that might show his movements over the past month. The security footage proved to be revealing. Over several hours, Sarah and James reviewed recordings from cameras throughout the palace. They found multiple instances of Chen entering restricted areas during his night shifts, always when minimal staff were present. Most disturbing was footage from 3 weeks earlier showing Chen leaving the Queen's private quarters, carrying a small bag that he hadn't had when entering. There's our smoking gun, James said, pointing at the screen. But this raises new questions. How did he know the security codes? How did he bypass the individual locks on the display cases? Their breakthrough came when they interviewed David's shift supervisor, Sergeant Collins, a 30-year veteran of palace security. Collins was reluctant to speak at first, but eventually revealed crucial information. David was always asking questions about the old security systems, Collins admitted. He said he was studying to advance his career, wanted to understand how everything worked. I thought it showed initiative, so I explained some of the older protocols to him. What kind of protocols? Sarah asked. Well, some of the lock codes in the older sections of the palace haven't been changed in years. Management keeps saying they'll upgrade the systems, but you know how slowly these things move in government. David specifically asked about the Queen's quarters, said he wanted to be prepared if he ever had to respond to an emergency there. Sarah felt a mixture of frustration and admiration for Chen's careful planning. He had systematically gathered information about security weaknesses and used his position to gain access to the most valuable items in the royal collection. As the day wore on, the investigation team expanded their search beyond Chen. They reviewed his personnel file more carefully and discovered that while his references had checked out at the time of hiring, several of the contact numbers were no longer in service. It appeared that Chen had created an elaborate, false identity to gain employment at the palace. The realization that they were dealing with a sophisticated, criminal operation rather than a simple opportunistic theft changed the entire scope of the investigation. Sarah knew they needed to act quickly before the stolen items disappeared into international black markets, but she also understood that Chen's escape meant they were now hunting a professional who had planned every detail of his crime. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Sarah received an urgent call from Scotland Yard's Art Crimes Unit. Detective Chief Inspector Robert Hamilton had been tracking international art theft rings for over a decade, and David Chen's description matched someone they had been investigating in connection with thefts from several European museums. We believe Chen is actually David Liu, a member of an organized group that specializes in high-value historical artifacts, Hamilton explained as he joined Sarah and James at Clarence House. He's been using false identities across Europe for the past 5 years, always gaining employment in security positions at museums, galleries, and private collections. The revelation that they were dealing with an international criminal added urgency to the investigation. Hamilton brought with him a thick file containing surveillance photos, financial records, and intelligence reports that painted a picture of a sophisticated operation with connections spanning multiple countries. Liu's group typically moves stolen items through a network of private collectors and black market dealers, Hamilton continued. Once these pieces enter that pipeline, they can disappear for decades before surfacing again. Sarah studied the photographs of David Liu, noting how different he looked in various disguises. How does someone like this get past royal security screening? They're extremely good at creating convincing false identities, Hamilton replied. They invest months or even years establishing backgrounds, creating employment histories, and building references. By the time they apply for positions, their cover stories are virtually undetectable through standard background checks. The team's focus shifted to tracking Liu's movements after he fled his apartment. Bank records showed that he had withdrawn substantial amounts of cash over the past week, suggesting he had been planning his escape. More concerning was evidence that he had made several international calls to numbers traced to known art dealers in Switzerland and Hong Kong. Commander Thompson coordinated with customs officials at all major airports and ports, but Sarah suspected that Liu was too experienced to attempt a conventional escape route. Professional art thieves typically had elaborate plans for moving both themselves and their stolen goods out of the country. Their break came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzpatrick, an elderly woman who cleaned offices in a building near Liu's apartment, contacted police after seeing his photograph on the evening news. She remembered seeing him loading boxes into a van very early that morning. Around 3 a.m., he was being very careful, looking around to make sure no one was watching. Mrs. Fitzpatrick told Sarah when they met at the police station, "But I have insomnia, so I was sitting by my window with a cup of tea." The way he was acting made me suspicious. More importantly, Mrs. Fitzpatrick had noted the van's license plate number. When police traced the vehicle, they discovered it had been rented using another false identity. But security cameras at the rental company provided clear footage of Liu. Picking up the van, the investigation team analyzed the timeline of Liu's movements and realized he had been methodically removing the stolen items from his apartment over several days, not just the morning he disappeared. This suggested a storage location where he was consolidating the stolen goods before making his final escape. Sarah's team worked through the night, mapping out possible routes Liu might have taken with the van and identifying potential storage facilities within a reasonable driving distance. They focused on locations that offered privacy and security, places where someone could store valuable items without attracting attention. The breakthrough came when they discovered that Liu had rented a storage unit under yet another false name at a facility in an industrial area outside London. The timing of the rental coincided with his employment at the palace, suggesting he had been planning the theft from the very beginning. When police surrounded the storage facility at dawn, they found Liu's van parked outside Unit 47. Inside the unit, they discovered careful packing materials and equipment for handling valuable artifacts. But the stolen royal treasures were nowhere to be found. "He's moved them again," James observed as they examined the empty storage space. This was just a temporary staging area. Sarah noticed that Liu had left behind some documents, apparently in his haste to move the items to their final destination. Among the papers were shipping manifests and customs declarations for artwork being exported to Switzerland. The documents were filled out for a company called Alpine Art Services, which further investigation revealed to be a front for international art smuggling. The trail led to a small airfield outside London, where Alpine Art Services maintained a private hangar. When police arrived, they found evidence that a small cargo plane had departed for Switzerland just hours earlier. Air traffic control confirmed that the flight plan listed art shipments as cargo, and Swiss authorities were immediately notified. However, when Swiss police raided the address listed in the shipping documents, they found only an empty warehouse. Liu and his associates had anticipated that their operation might be discovered and had contingency plans in place. The investigation was becoming an international manhunt, but Sarah remained focused on the human element of the case. Liu's careful planning suggested he had been studying the royal family's routines and security procedures for months before making his move. She wondered if there were other inside sources that had provided him with information. A review of palace employment records revealed that Liu had developed relationships with several staff members during his time there. Most concerning was his friendship with Thomas Ashworth, a junior member of the palace maintenance crew who had access to blueprints and technical information about the building's security systems. When questioned, Ashworth initially denied any wrongdoing, but eventually admitted that he had shared information about the palace's layout and security procedures with Liu. He said he was writing a paper about security systems for a correspondence course. Ashworth explained, clearly distressed. I thought I was helping him with his education. Ashworth's cooperation proved valuable in understanding exactly how Liu had planned and executed the theft. The maintenance worker had unknowingly provided detailed information about security camera blind spots, shift change schedules, and the locations of the most valuable items in the Queen's collection. Liu knew exactly what he was looking for, Sarah realized as she reviewed Ashworth's testimony. He didn't just steal randomly. He targeted specific pieces that would be most valuable to private collectors. The international dimension of the case meant that recovery of the stolen items would require cooperation from law enforcement agencies across multiple countries. Sarah knew that time was working against them. As each day increased the likelihood that the treasures would disappear into private collections, where they might never be recovered. Meanwhile, palace officials were growing increasingly concerned about maintaining secrecy around the theft. The Queen was due to return from her state visit within days, and there were questions about whether to inform her immediately or wait until the investigation had made more progress. Sarah understood the delicate balance between solving the crime and managing the potential political and public relations consequences. The stolen items weren't just valuable artifacts. They were symbols of British heritage and royal tradition. Their loss would be felt not just by the royal family but by the entire nation. Queen Camilla's unexpected early return from Australia caught everyone off guard. Her plane touched down at Heathrow 2 days ahead of schedule due to a family emergency, and palace officials scrambled to decide how and when to inform her about the theft. Sarah found herself in the uncomfortable position of having to brief the Queen before the investigation was complete. The meeting took place in the Queen's private study at Clarence House. Sarah had never been in the presence of royalty before, and despite her years of police training, she felt nervous as she waited for the Queen to arrive. When Queen Camilla entered the room, she appeared tired from her long flight but maintained the dignified composure that Sarah had seen in countless photographs and television appearances. Detective Inspector Mitchell, the Queen said, settling into her chair with a grace that spoke of decades of royal protocol, Commander Thompson has informed me that there's been a security incident involving my personal collection. I understand the situation is quite serious. Sarah had prepared for this moment, but finding the right words to tell the Queen that her most treasured possessions had been stolen proved more difficult than anticipated. Your Majesty, I'm afraid we've discovered that several items from your private collection are missing. We believe they were taken by a member of the palace security staff who has since fled the country. The Queen's expression remained controlled, but Sarah noticed her hands tighten slightly on the arms of her chair. Which items are we talking about, Detective Inspector? Sarah consulted her notes, though she had memorized the list of missing pieces. The sapphire parure that belonged to Queen Mary, several brooches including the flame lily brooch, an emerald bracelet, and what appears to be the Cambridge lover's knot tiara, among other pieces. For the first time, the Queen's composure wavered. The Cambridge lover's knot tiara had been one of Princess Diana's favorites, and its theft carried emotional significance far beyond its monetary value. That tiara has been in the family for over a century, the Queen said quietly. It was worn by my predecessor at her wedding to Prince Charles. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. These weren't just valuable objects. They were irreplaceable links to royal history and personal memories. Your Majesty, I want to assure you that we're doing everything possible to recover these items. We've identified the thief and are working with international law enforcement to track down the stolen pieces. The Queen asked detailed questions about the investigation, demonstrating a sharp understanding of security procedures and criminal investigation, techniques that surprised Sarah. It became clear that Queen Camilla was not merely a figurehead but someone who took an active interest in the practical aspects of royal administration. Detective Inspector, I need you to understand something, the Queen said as their meeting drew to a close. Some of these pieces have significance that goes beyond their material value. The flame lily brooch, for instance, was a gift from the Commonwealth nations for my 70th birthday. Its loss would be felt not just by me but by people across the empire who contributed to its creation. After leaving the Queen's presence, Sarah felt a renewed sense of urgency about the investigation. The personal nature of the theft had been brought home to her in a way that made it more than just another case to solve. Meanwhile, international cooperation was beginning to yield results. Swiss authorities had traced the Alpine Art Services Company to a network of shell corporations operating across multiple European countries. Financial records showed large money transfers between these companies and several known art dealers who specialized in stolen goods. Breakthrough came when German police raided a warehouse in Hamburg based on intelligence provided by the British investigation. Inside, they discovered a sophisticated operation for altering and disguising stolen artwork and artifacts. More importantly, they arrested Klaus Weber, a known associate of David Liu, who had been managing the European end of the smuggling operation. Weber's arrest led to the recovery of several stolen items from previous thefts, but none of the royal treasures were found at the Hamburg location. Under questioning, Weber revealed that the royal pieces had been considered so valuable and recognizable that they required special handling. The British royal items were too hot to move through normal channels, Weber told investigators. Liu had a special buyer lined up, someone who collects pieces specifically because of their historical significance rather than their monetary value. This revelation opened up a new avenue of investigation. The team realized they were looking for a private collector who was wealthy enough to purchase priceless artifacts and sophisticated enough to arrange for their theft. Such individuals typically operated in the shadows of the art world, building collections that would never be displayed publicly. Sarah worked with Interpol's art crimes database to identify potential buyers who might be interested in British royal artifacts. The list was surprisingly long, including wealthy individuals from Russia, China, the Middle East, and the United States, who had previously been linked to purchases of stolen, historical items. The investigation took another turn when bank records revealed that Liu had received a substantial payment from a numbered account in the Cayman Islands just days before the theft. The timing suggested that the theft had been commissioned rather than opportunistic, meaning someone had specifically wanted the royal pieces enough to pay for their theft. Tracing the Cayman Islands account required cooperation from financial authorities in multiple jurisdictions, a process that could take weeks or months. Sarah knew that every day of delay increased the chances that the stolen treasures would disappear permanently into a private collection. However, their persistence paid off when a routine security check at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris flagged Liu attempting to board a flight to Hong Kong. French authorities arrested him, and a search of his luggage revealed detailed photographs of the stolen royal treasures along with authentication documents that would have been used to verify their provenance to potential buyers. Liu's arrest was a major breakthrough, but interrogating him proved challenging. As an experienced international criminal, he understood his rights and the value of the information he possessed. He immediately requested legal representation and made it clear that he would only cooperate in exchange for significant concessions from prosecutors. Sarah and James flew to Paris to participate in the questioning, working alongside French police and Interpol agents. The interrogation room was tense as Liu sat across from them, displaying the calm confidence of someone who had been through similar situations before. "Mr. Liu," Sarah began, "we know you stole artifacts from Queen Camilla's private collection. We have video evidence, witness testimony, and physical evidence linking you to the theft. What we need to know is where those items are now." Liu smiled slightly. "Detective Inspector, I think you overestimate what you can prove in court. Yes, I worked at the palace, but that doesn't make me a thief. As for any missing items, perhaps the palace should look more carefully at their inventory procedures." The cat-and-mouse game continued for hours, with Liu admitting nothing while his lawyers negotiated with prosecutors about potential plea agreements. Sarah knew that time was running out. With each passing hour, the stolen treasures could be moved further away from their reach. The pressure to recover the royal heirlooms was mounting from multiple sources. Media outlets were beginning to ask questions about unusual police activity around the palace, and royal protection officials were concerned about potential security leaks. Most importantly, Queen Camilla was asking daily for updates on the investigation, clearly distressed about the loss of items that connected her to the royal family's history. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. While Lou remained silent in French custody, his associate Klaus Weber in Germany began cooperating with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. Weber's information led investigators to a luxury apartment in Monaco, where Lou had been storing the most valuable stolen pieces before their final sale. Sarah accompanied a joint task force of British, French, and Monegasque police to the Mediterranean Principality. The apartment was located in a prestigious building overlooking the harbor, the kind of place where wealthy individuals could store valuable items without attracting unwanted attention from neighbors or authorities. When they entered the apartment, Sarah's heart raced. The living room had been converted into a makeshift gallery, with professional lighting and climate control systems protecting the displayed artifacts. There, arranged on velvet-lined display cases, were the missing royal treasures. The Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara sat in a place of honor, its diamonds and sapphires catching the light from the carefully positioned spotlights. Nearby, the Queen Mary sapphire parure was displayed in its complete form, with the necklace, earrings, and matching bracelet arranged as they would have been for a royal portrait. The flame lily brooch and the emerald bracelet that had so concerned Queen Camilla were also present, along with several other pieces from the royal collection. "It's like a private museum," James observed as they carefully photographed each item before the recovery team began the delicate process of packing them for return to Britain. Whoever was planning to buy these wanted to display them properly. The apartment revealed more than just the stolen royal treasures. In a locked safe, investigators found documentation relating to numerous other thefts across Europe, along with a client list that read like a who's who of international wealth. The scale of Lou's operation was far larger than anyone had initially suspected. Among the documents was correspondence with someone identified only as the collector, who had specifically commissioned the theft of the royal pieces. The letters, written in careful, educated prose, demonstrated an obsessive knowledge of British royal history and a particular fascination with items that had belonged to previous queens. The collector had provided detailed specifications about which items to target, including historical information about their provenance and significance that could only have come from someone with deep knowledge of the royal collection. Most disturbing was a letter expressing disappointment that Lou had not been able to obtain Queen Victoria's diamond diadem, which was apparently the ultimate prize in this twisted collecting scheme. Sarah realized they were dealing with someone whose motivation went beyond simple greed. This was a person who was so obsessed with royal history that they were willing to commission thefts to possess these unique pieces of British heritage. The investigation team worked around the clock to trace the identity of the collector. The letters had been sent through a series of intermediaries and offshore companies, creating a complex web designed to hide the true sender's identity. However, the detailed knowledge of royal history and the specific interest in pieces related to Queen Victoria provided important clues. Working with experts from the Royal Collection Trust, Sarah developed a profile of someone who was not just wealthy enough to commission such thefts, but also educated enough to understand the historical significance of each piece. The suspect was likely someone with academic credentials in British history or art history, possibly someone who had worked in museums or auction houses. The breakthrough came when handwriting analysis of the letters matched samples from academic papers published by Dr. Marcus Whitman, a former curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum, who had been dismissed 5 years earlier for attempting to sell museum artifacts for personal gain. Whitman had disappeared after his dismissal, and subsequent investigation revealed that he had been building a private collection of stolen historical artifacts. Tracking down Whitman proved challenging, as he had been living under assumed names and moving frequently between different countries. However, financial records from the Monaco apartment led investigators to a remote estate in the Swiss Alps, where Whitman had been living as a reclusive collector surrounded by his ill-gotten treasures. The estate was like something from a movie, a medieval castle that had been converted into a private museum. When Swiss police raided the property, they found rooms filled with stolen artifacts from dozens of institutions across Europe. Whitman had been operating as the collector for years, commissioning thefts of specific pieces that appealed to his obsessions with various historical periods. In his private study, investigators found detailed plans for future thefts, including a scheme to steal the crown jewels from the Tower of London. Whitman's ambitions had grown over the years, and the successful theft of Queen Camilla's treasures had apparently emboldened him to plan even more audacious crimes. Whitman's arrest was the culmination of weeks of intense investigation, but Sarah knew that the case was far from over. The stolen royal treasures had been recovered, but the complex international network that had made the theft possible remained largely intact. Lew and Whitman were significant figures, but they were part of a larger criminal enterprise that specialized in stealing cultural artifacts. For wealthy private collectors, the process of returning the royal treasures to Britain required careful coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies and diplomatic channels. Each piece had to be authenticated by experts from the Royal Collection Trust to ensure that they were genuine and had not been damaged during their time in criminal hands. Sarah personally escorted the treasures back to London, understanding the historical and emotional significance of her cargo. The flight back to Britain felt like a victory lap, but she also knew that the recovery was just the beginning of the justice process that would follow. Queen Camilla was informed of the recovery while still in her private apartments at Clarence House. Commander Thompson delivered the news personally, and Sarah was told that Her Majesty had shown visible relief upon hearing that the treasures were safe and would be returned to their proper place in the royal collection. The media attention surrounding the case was carefully managed by palace officials, who emphasized the successful recovery of the stolen items while downplaying the security failures that had made the theft possible. The story was presented as a triumph of international law enforcement cooperation rather than a serious breach of royal security. However, Sarah knew that the investigation had revealed serious vulnerabilities in palace security procedures. The ease with which Lew had gained employment and access to restricted areas highlighted the need for more rigorous background checks and improved security protocols. The case also raised broader questions about the protection of cultural heritage. The international network of collectors and dealers who facilitated such thefts operated in a gray area of the art market, where questions about provenance were often overlooked in favor of profit. As Sarah reflected on the investigation, she realized that the recovery of Queen Camilla's treasures was both an ending and a beginning. The immediate crisis had been resolved, but the underlying problems that had made the theft possible would require ongoing attention and reform. The formal ceremony for the return of Queen Camilla's treasures took place in the throne room at Buckingham Palace, a private event attended only by senior royal family members, key palace officials, and the investigation team that had worked to recover the stolen pieces. Sarah stood alongside James and Commander Thompson as the treasures were formally presented back to the Queen. Queen Camilla examined each piece carefully, her face showing a mixture of relief and sadness as she held the Cambridge lover's knot tiara. "To think that this nearly disappeared forever," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of understanding how close these irreplaceable pieces of history had come to being lost permanently. The Queen's personal examination of the recovered treasures revealed something unexpected. As she handled the Queen Mary sapphire parure, she noticed that one of the earrings felt different from its partner. Expert examination confirmed her suspicions. Lew had replaced one of the original sapphires with a high-quality synthetic stone, apparently selling the original gem separately to maximize his profits. This discovery led to a renewed investigation into Lew's activities during his time at the palace. Review of security footage and additional interviews with staff revealed that he had been systematically photographing and cataloging valuable items throughout the royal collection, not just in Queen Camilla's private quarters but in other areas of the palace as well. The scope of Lew's intelligence gathering was staggering. He had created detailed maps of the palace layout, photographed security cameras and their coverage areas, and documented the daily routines of senior staff members. His preparation for the theft had been meticulous, suggesting that he had been planning the operation for most of his time as a palace employee. More disturbing was the discovery that Lew had been in contact with other criminals who were gathering similar intelligence at royal residences across Europe. The investigation revealed a coordinated effort to map the security vulnerabilities of various royal palaces, with the apparent goal of conducting multiple thefts simultaneously. Sarah worked with Interpol to share intelligence with police forces in Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands, where similar suspicious activities had been reported at royal palaces. The international nature of the conspiracy required unprecedented cooperation between law enforcement agencies that typically guarded their information jealously. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Liu had attempted to recruit additional palace staff members to provide inside information. Several employees came forward to report that he had asked unusual questions about security procedures and offered small payments for seemingly innocent information about royal schedules and routines. Thomas Ashworth, the maintenance worker who had unknowingly provided Liu with security information, was placed on administrative leave pending a full security review. While he had not knowingly participated in criminal activity, his cooperation with Liu had compromised palace security in ways that could have had catastrophic consequences. Commander Thompson found himself under intense scrutiny from palace officials and government security services. The successful theft had occurred on his watch, and questions were being raised about whether he should continue in his position. The pressure was evident in his appearance and demeanor as he worked to implement new security protocols designed to prevent similar breaches. The security review, ordered by Buckingham Palace, was comprehensive and far-reaching. Every aspect of palace operations was examined, from hiring procedures to access controls to emergency response protocols. The report, when completed, ran to over 300 pages and contained recommendations for fundamental changes in how royal security was managed. One of the most significant recommendations was the establishment of a new position, Director of Cultural Heritage Security, who would be responsible specifically for protecting the royal collections and ensuring that proper safeguards were in place for all valuable artifacts. The position would require someone with expertise in both law enforcement and art history. Reflecting the specialized nature of the threat posed by criminals like Liu and Whitman, Sarah found herself being considered for this new position, a career opportunity that would represent a significant departure from traditional police work. The role would involve developing new protocols for protecting cultural heritage, working with international law enforcement agencies, and serving as a liaison between the police and various royal households. The legal proceedings against Liu and Whitman began several months after their arrests, with trials scheduled to take place in multiple jurisdictions. Liu faced charges in Britain for theft and conspiracy, in France for international art trafficking, and in Germany for his connections to the Hamburg smuggling operation. Whitman faced similar charges in Switzerland and Britain, with additional counts related to his previous thefts from museums and private collections. The complexity of the international case meant that the legal process would likely continue for years, with various appeals and extradition proceedings creating ongoing complications. Sarah knew that she would be required to testify in multiple trials and continue working on related investigations as more evidence came to light. The psychological impact of the theft on Queen Camilla became apparent during the security review interviews. While she maintained her public composure, palace staff reported that she had become much more cautious about discussing her collection and had requested that several of her most treasured pieces be moved to more secure storage at the Tower of London. The Queen's personal connection to the stolen items went beyond their monetary value. During one interview, she spoke movingly about how each piece connected her to the history of the monarchy and to the family members who had worn them before her. The Cambridge lover's knot tiara, in particular, held special significance as a link to Princess Diana and the complex history of the royal family's relationships. The media coverage of the case was carefully managed, but investigative journalists began asking pointed questions about security vulnerabilities at royal residences. Freedom of Information requests sought details about security spending and protocols, creating pressure for greater transparency about measures designed to protect the royal family and their possessions. Public opinion was generally supportive of the royal family in the aftermath of the theft, with many people expressing relief that the stolen treasures had been recovered. However, there were also questions about whether taxpayer-funded security was adequate and whether the royal family was taking sufficient precautions to protect items of national significance. The case also sparked broader discussions about the protection of cultural heritage. In an era of increasingly sophisticated international crime, museums, galleries, and private collectors around the world began reviewing their own security procedures in light of the revelations about how Liu and his associates had operated. Sarah's role in the investigation had brought her to the attention of senior government officials, who were considering how to apply the lessons learned from the royal theft to the protection of other national treasures. The British Museum, the National Gallery, and other major institutions were all reassessing their vulnerabilities and updating their security protocols. As the immediate crisis passed and normal palace routines resumed, Sarah reflected on how the case had changed her understanding of both law enforcement and the importance of cultural heritage. The theft had been about more than money. It had been an attack on the continuity of British history and the symbols that connected the present to the past. 2 years after the theft, Sarah stood in her new office overlooking the Thames, now serving as the first director of cultural heritage security for the Royal Collection Trust. The position had evolved beyond what anyone had initially envisioned, growing into a comprehensive program that protected not only the royal collections but also coordinated with museums and cultural institutions across Britain. The trials of David, Liu, and Marcus Whitman had concluded the previous month, with both men receiving substantial prison sentences. Liu was sentenced to 12 years for theft, conspiracy, and international art trafficking, while Whitman received 15 years for his role as the mastermind behind multiple thefts across Europe. The sentences sent a strong message to other criminals who might consider targeting cultural heritage sites. However, Sarah knew that the convictions were only part of the solution. The investigation had revealed the existence of a vast international network of collectors, dealers, and criminals who specialized in stealing and trafficking cultural artifacts. Dismantling this network required ongoing cooperation between law enforcement agencies around the world. The new security protocols implemented at royal residences had proven effective, with no major incidents reported since the theft of Queen Camilla's treasures. The changes went far beyond simple improvements to locks and cameras. They included comprehensive background checks for all employees, regular security audits, and a new system for tracking the movement of valuable items within the royal collection. Commander Thompson had survived the security review and remained in his position, but the experience had clearly affected him. He had become a strong advocate for the reforms and worked closely with Sarah to ensure that the lessons learned from the theft were applied throughout the royal protection system. Queen Camilla had gradually returned to her normal routines, though she remained more cautious about displaying her most valuable pieces. The recovered treasures had been examined by conservation experts and were found to be in excellent condition, though the knowledge that they had been stolen and handled by criminals had diminished their emotional significance for the Queen. The Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara had been particularly affected by its theft. While physically undamaged, the Queen rarely wore it now, feeling that its connection to the royal family's history had been somehow tainted by its time in criminal hands. The tiara was now displayed in a special exhibition about royal jewelry, where its story served as a reminder of the importance of protecting cultural heritage. Sarah's new role had brought her into contact with cultural heritage experts around the world. She had traveled to museums in New York, Paris, and Tokyo, sharing the lessons learned from the royal theft investigation and helping other institutions improve their security procedures. The case had become a landmark study in art crime investigation, with Sarah frequently speaking at international conferences about protecting cultural artifacts. The investigation had also led to significant changes in how law enforcement agencies cooperated on art crime cases. A new international task force had been established specifically to combat the theft and trafficking of cultural heritage items, with Sarah serving as the British representative. The task force had already been successful in recovering stolen artifacts and disrupting several criminal networks. One of the most important developments was the creation of a comprehensive database of stolen cultural artifacts that could be accessed by law enforcement agencies, customs officials, and legitimate art dealers around the world. The database helped prevent stolen items from being sold through legal channels and made it easier to track the movement of suspicious artifacts. The financial impact of the theft had extended far beyond the value of the stolen items themselves. Insurance premiums for cultural institutions had increased significantly, and many organizations had been forced to invest heavily in improved security systems. However, these costs were generally seen as necessary. Investments in protecting irreplaceable cultural heritage. Sarah's team had also developed new training programs for security personnel working at cultural institutions. The programs emphasized the importance of understanding not just physical security, but also the historical and cultural significance of the items being protected. Guards who understood the importance of their responsibilities were more likely to remain vigilant and report suspicious activities. The psychological impact of the theft continued to resonate throughout the royal household. Staff members who had worked with Liu during his time at the palace struggled with feelings of betrayal and uncertainty about trusting new colleagues. Counseling services had been provided to help employees process their experiences and rebuild confidence in their workplace security. Queen Camilla had personally thanked Sarah for her role in recovering the stolen treasures, but the Queen had also spoken about how the incident had changed her relationship with her collection. "These pieces represent centuries of history," she had said during their final meeting about the case. "The fact that they could have been lost forever has made me more aware of my responsibility as their custodian." The media attention surrounding the case had eventually subsided, but investigative journalists continued to follow developments in art crime and cultural heritage protection. The royal theft had highlighted broader issues about the vulnerability of cultural institutions and the international nature of art trafficking networks. Sarah often reflected on how the case had changed her career and her understanding of law enforcement. Traditional police work had prepared her for dealing with crimes against persons and property, but protecting cultural heritage required a different approach that combined investigation skills with historical knowledge and international cooperation. The success of the investigation had also led to increased funding for art crime units within police forces across Europe. The realization that cultural heritage theft was not just a property crime but an attack on national identity and historical continuity had elevated the priority given to such cases by government officials and law enforcement leaders. Sarah looked out at the Thames from her office window. She could see the Tower of London in the distance, where many of the royal treasures were now stored under enhanced security. The sight reminded her of the continuity of British history and the importance of preserving that heritage for future generations. The case of Queen Camilla's stolen treasures had ended with their successful recovery, but it had also begun a new chapter in the protection of cultural heritage. Sarah knew that criminals like Liu and Whitman would continue to emerge, driven by the enormous profits available in the illegal art market. Her job was to ensure that law enforcement stayed ahead of these threats and that the treasures of human civilization remained protected for future generations to appreciate and study. The investigation had proven that international cooperation and dedicated expertise could overcome even the most sophisticated criminal networks. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that cultural heritage was worth fighting for, not just because of its monetary value, but because of its irreplaceable role in connecting people to their history and identity.